Kenna, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I know we have worked together for a little bit here, and I've known you for a little over a year. But for the listeners, this podcast is about research, obviously, and I'd love to know a little bit about your relationship to research and what it means to you.
Sure. So I've been in the research world now for a while since I was in my undergraduate program. I've always been really interested in the social sciences and understanding why people do the things that they do. My academic background is in psychology and criminology. So that was kind of where I got my start in exploring some of these topics and themes. And I've kind of moved from public safety then into workplace safety. But research is so important because it builds reliability. It can challenge or it can confirm our own ideas. I've done research where, the results were exactly what I would think that they would be. I've done research where it was the opposite of what I thought, and I had to go back and look at it from a new angle and understand why I got that result. And I think especially in our space, when with the National Safety Council, when we talk, people tend to listen. So I feel like there's a lot of responsibility on us to make sure that the work we're doing is reliable, that we're doing the best with the information we have. Because at the end of the day, what we say has consequences on policies and workplaces and ultimately on the worker, which is, who I have in mind when I'm doing this research.
Yeah, I like the fact that you brought up that this is supposed to, research challenges sometimes the way that we think about things. Sometimes it doesn't always end up the way we thought it was going to, but there's a ton of stuff that we can learn just from that when you prove the null hypothesis versus what you thought was going to happen. So, yeah, that's really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Now, I know a lot of your work recently, of course, has been centered around safety technology. So, what really interests you about doing that type of research?
Yeah, so I've been in the tech space now for a while. I got my start in sort of the retail security loss prevention sector. So we were looking at things like computer vision, anti-theft technologies, virtual reality, AI, of course. And that's kind of where I got my start. And throughout my experience there and with the NSC, I've learned a lot about technology. I've seen a lot of case studies and I've seen the great potential that I think it can have on workplace safety. But I've also seen how the wrong solutions can have very bad impacts, from eroding trust to slowing down employees to creating frustration. So that's really what focuses me is that human element within technology and how we as the human and that technology can coexist together to make that environment stronger overall.
Gosh, that's so important, right? Making sure that technology is shaped to the human, right? The human's not going away. The technology is really intended to make the human perform better. So that's extremely important part of this. So really, up to this point, what do we know about safety technology? I mean, what has been proven, and what do we still need to overcome?
Proven is such a strong word.
I know.
So yeah, that's such a research answer, I guess. I would say, what's been proven is that these technologies have great potential. When we're talking about safety technologies, I have a lot of confidence that there's solutions out there that can help protect workers. I would say that something that's been proven is that there's not a one size fits all
Mm.
solution. Like, there's
Hmm.
not a silver bullet to safety. I mean, maybe in the future, we'll see. But, I think really what's been proven is that organizations need to take a very individualized and tailored approach to technology, right? They need to involve their workers. They need to make sure that they're ready for it, both from the infrastructure side and from the culture side. But, I think overall, what's been proven is that there's a lot of potential. There are employers out there who are doing fantastic things with technologies, but it's just really all about, how and where you implement those, where that difference arises.
Yeah, there's so many things that come up when it comes to implementing technology. And I think you bring up a really good point. One size does not fit all. Every organization is going to run into their own challenges. They have their own things that they're trying to solve with technology. And, of course, probably one of the biggest things is starting with the problem you're trying to solve and not, going for the shiny object, the technology that you think might solve a problem implementing it and then finding the problem it should be solving.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if you're looking at the same risk across industries, right? I've seen technologies trying to sort of attack the same hazard. It may work perfectly well in manufacturing, but you move into a construction environment and it's just so different that that technology maybe doesn't work in a different way, or you just have to apply it in a different way. So, yeah, there's a lot of variables to look into for sure.
No, absolutely. So, what really are those significant challenges that organizations are facing when they're trying to use technology? I know we just mentioned a couple, but there's probably a ton of things that organizations are running into.
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? So, to your point, it's making sure that this technology is actually addressing the risk you want to address. I think there are, great technologies and great vendors out there, but you have to be careful about, where you're applying it and what you're actually trying to tackle. I would say one of the biggest challenges that I see over and over again are organizations who just are not ready to implement.
Mm,
I think a lot of times we look at that from an infrastructure standpoint. Like, do you have the IT resources? Do you have the knowledge and the ability to actually technically implement these things? But I think the bigger one is culture, especially as we get into technologies that are more involved with the worker. If we're looking at things like connected worker devices or computer vision that may be sort of tracking their movements. You've got to have the right culture for that to work for your environment. You will realize very quickly if a technology is not going to be a good fit. So, making sure that you are actually engaging with folks beforehand. I know I've been through it. I'm sure you've been through it where you just hear one day that there's a new software or there's new tech you're going to try, and then it's sunsetted a year later because, people just aren't using it. So I think making sure you have that cultural buy-in and that you're just engaging with people is one of the biggest barriers, but I think, in my opinion, one of the most fun to try to tackle because you get to actually engage with your people and learn what they're interested in and learn what they think about technology. So,
yeah, okay. So there's a few things that you just brought up that are insanely important. One of the things that I've always talked about when it comes to technology is that transparency piece with the workers, with the supervisors, with everybody else in the organization, right? With so many pieces of technology that are out there, one of the crucial components of that technology is the data that it collects, right? So when you implement a technology, you have to be honest and transparent with the workers about the data that you're collecting and why you're collecting it and how you're using it and how you are protecting it, making sure that, you're not using it for nefarious reasons and, their identity isn't going to end up somewhere out there in cyberspace where it can get stolen. Like all of those things are super important. I know I didn't write this question down, but you kind of hit on it a little bit, and I'm sure you've got a good answer for it, but if an organization wants to know if they're even ready to implement technology, how do they assess something like that?
yeah, well, I'll do a quick plug for the Work to Zero program. We have a great digital readiness assessment that kind of looks into, some of those infrastructure components that I mentioned. I would say as far as the cultural side of things, it doesn't have to be complicated. You can potentially do your focus groups and your surveys and really try to understand, what folks think of it. But the first place to start is just having conversations with the people you see every day, understanding what risks they're facing. I've always said that the workers are the eyes and the ears of your organization. They're going to know what's going on before you're going to know what's going on. And especially when it comes to, whatever hazards they face on a daily basis, they are going to know and understand those best. And they're going to know and understand if a technology has that potential or if it's just going to inhibit them or potentially create other risks. So even just having, those conversations with a small group or even one person at a time can really help.
Yeah, I want to give a quick shout out to my friend Jason Coons. I sat in on one of his sessions recently, and by the way, he has become a phenomenal speaker. If you haven't had a chance to listen to him, he really gives a just a tremendous message. But, when it comes to having those conversations with your workers and, trying to identify what they're thinking, what problems they're running into, I feel like some folks don't know where to start with that conversation. And he said, there's two questions you can ask that are really important and going to be really impactful and help you figure out what problems you're actually having. He said, ask them, where is my next fatality going to happen? That's question number one. And question number two, what can I do about it? Or what can we do about it? And
Yep.
just those two questions, and you know, you can give them a little bit of homework, right? Put it on a post-it note and hand it to them and come back the next day for the toolbox talk and say, you know, give the answer. That's all you need to know where your next step needs to be. And that's when you know probably if technology is going to be the solution or if you need to look at something else. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
And
great
what I
place
really appreciate about that is how open-ended it is.
hmm
It's really going to get them thinking. I live in the world of technology, but even just the way that's phrased, it could be, something, a very simple fix, right? It could
hmm
be, how the workplace is organized. It could be, additional PPE. It could be technology. But I think that really broadens you to maybe some even less complex solutions that you can try first before you
Yeah.
try to deploy technology. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
So that kind of leads us into the next question. There's a lot of safety professionals that listen to this podcast and researchers too and you know just general end users. But you know, I think what's critical is to understand how the EHS professional really plays a role when it comes to implementing technology. Obviously, they are not going to be the sole decision maker. There's a lot of people that are going to play a role in that implementation piece. But what should the EHS professional anticipate as their role in implementing technology?
Yeah, I would say that there are kind of two distinct roles that come to mind for that EHS professional. The first one is going to be making sure that that technology isn't introducing any new risks, right?
hmm
So if you're going to implement a wearable, make sure it can't be, grabbed or snatched or caught in machinery. If it's something that's going to alert workers, you want to make sure that they're not going to get alert fatigue, right? How many
Mm-hmm.
notifications do you get on a daily basis? A lot. So, there's going to come a point where they're going to hear these alarms and get these notifications. And if you have too many, it's just not going to mean anything. So that first part is just making sure that the technology itself is safe in your environment. The second, I would say, is they have great potential to be a champion for that technology. We talked earlier about having conversations with workers, and hopefully, as that EHS pro, you are having these face-to-face conversations every day. You should be coaching your workers, helping them improve their safety, having these conversations. So, you should hopefully be a good place for workers to come to you with new ideas or even come to you about concerns about new technologies if they have any. I would say those two are kind of where I think they land.
Yeah, no, excellent point, especially about the alert fatigue. So that is something I experience on a daily basis. I don't know how many times I've walked downstairs, looked at my wife, and she said, "Did you get my text?" Uh, no.
Yep.
Because my phone and my watch they buzz all day long and I'm deep into my work and totally ignoring whatever notifications are coming across. So, yeah, that's a really interesting point and one that it's a risk, right? You have to make sure that workers aren't getting desensitized to whatever that technology is supposed to be alerting them about. You know, I we were at a conference recently where we were looking at a technology and it was really interesting. It was a wearable sensor, but it wasn't designed necessarily to be worn all the time. It was, you know, something to train the worker on their posturing. So you put this wearable device on your foot or you put it on your arm or whatever makes sense for that situation. And there's a range of motion in which the device would actually train or it would vibrate and that was supposed to be the good spot, right? That's where you want that limb or that foot or whatever, that's the position you want it to be in, and you train for a while for the worker to respond correctly to that, and then you take it off, right? So it's more about training the, you know, that specific motion and not necessarily the alert. So there's no alert fatigue. You are literally training that motion. So anyway, it just made me think of that. I thought that was really interesting we're seeing so many new interesting technologies come out every day. It's so cool. Maybe that's a good segue into our next question here because we want to talk about the developers too. And there's going to be the challenges that the organizations face. There's going to be things that safety professionals need to know, but there are also things that developers need to know, specifically when it comes to workplace safety, which is a super, super complex topic. What should developers know as they start putting together this technology for workplace safety applications?
Yeah, I would say number one is if wherever possible is simplicity over complexity,
Mm,
right? So in workplaces, we've got people who are already probably working overtime, already have things on their plate. So these devices need to be user friendly. They need to be easy to deploy, and they need to be as frictionless as possible, right? So that could include, if it's a wearable, where they pick it up for the day. If it's a software, that user experience has to be easy and pretty thoughtless for them to be able to plug in and move on with their day. Another thing I would say is going back to making sure that your technology isn't introducing new risks. One of the other ones that I think about is just over reliance on technology, which can also happen. So, something that comes to mind is proximity sensors, right? They can be great as sort of that last effort, right? If there's an equipment that's going to strike a pedestrian, you want it to alert, but that can never replace just the operator and the pedestrian being alert and being aware of their surroundings. So I think being aware that over-reliance can happen, and I would also say being aware of that alert fatigue. So if you're creating anything that's going to alert, you want to make sure that it's calibrated correctly, that you're not going to have false alarms, because the more false alarms you have, you're going to have that boy who cried wolf effect, and they're going to start ignoring it. And then if there is really an emergency or a risk to them, they may ignore that alert. So I would definitely say simplicity, and then just be aware of the environment where your technology is going to be implemented, and what new risks it may introduce, and how you, as either that developer or that salesperson or the technical support, can help organizations overcome those.
yeah, really good point. So, we've talked a little bit about technology, but I want to go back to a really important research question that I ask everybody that comes on this podcast, especially those that are actively either using research or doing research. And it's the fact that we have this phenomenon that is a gap between research and practice. We have all of this stuff that sits in an academic library that's really, really, really good information, but there's difficulty in getting that stuff into the practitioner's hands. So, what really are the challenges from your perspective? What are the disconnect, or why are there disconnects, and what are you doing that's helping to bridge this gap?
Yeah, I mean that's it's a huge topic, and it's so important. And I have a couple things that come to mind. The first is going to be, and I think you'd agree with me, is that more and more I feel like research is becoming very polarized.
Mm,
And I think at the intersection of workplace safety, we are right in the middle of a lot of very polarizing topics, right? Between automation and workers, between more regulation and more bureaucracy versus corporate freedom. We deal with issues around worker surveillance. And, I think there is the potential on either side for research to maybe not be trusted by folks, not trust the source of that research. So, the first place we have to start is by being as unbiased as we can, by consolidating that research. And that's one area where I've always focused on is I will tell you all of the benefits of this technology, but I want to make it very clear to you where there are going to be some of these risks, some of these drawbacks, what industries this might not work in right now. So I think that's kind of the first area, is just, trying to present that research as unbiased as you can, and to pull from, as many different sources as you can. And then I think another problem is just, you kind of pointed to it, the system we built around research. Academic studies are largely behind paywalls. They are usually written for other academics. And in my experience, especially on the tech side, you have your very technical validation studies in labs to see if these technologies work, or you have one-off case studies of an organization using this technology. But we're kind of missing these larger, systematic reviews. And for your average EHS professional who's probably working overtime and has a million other things to do, they don't have time to go through and do their own meta-analysis of 100 different studies to find out if a wearable is going to work for them, right? So I think that's where, Work to Zero can plug in, really being transparent about where these technologies are being used, understand the research that's coming out about how and where they're best applied, and going back to that human element of understanding what is actually the best way to implement these technologies. So I'd say those are probably the two biggest challenges that come to mind.
Excellent. I actually, the polarization topic has not really come up on this podcast yet, but it's a really, really good point. And I think that's actually one of the main intentions of this podcast, I think, is to, sort of uncover some of those biases that can exist in even, what is supposed to be rigorous academic research, or stuff that's
Absolutely.
presented as rigorous academic research and is really funded by the folks who are going to benefit most from it. Yeah, creating that transparency and negating that bias where we can, I think is extremely important. So, yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think, the especially with technology, the challenge is that so much of this stuff is tested in that lab setting, or you have these one-off case studies, which are also really informative, but it's not the whole picture. It worked for this situation for this organization. How do I know if it's going to work for my organization? And that picture doesn't get painted very well often enough for folks to make an informed decision. And then like the other part is you've got a sales pitch and the developer did their own case study that they wrote up or their own white paper, and those can also be informative too, but you have to look at it through that critical lens of,
Yep.
okay, where did this research come from? Who's paying for it? And why is it only telling me the good stuff and not any of the bad stuff?
Yep. Yep. And I think that's another place where we can plug into is there's just not a lot of research out there,
Hmm.
period. So I think that's another area where we plug in is trying to implement or test these technologies in as many different environments as we can so that we can say, yeah, it'll work for you, or no, this might not work for you. This might work better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, the work that you do is fascinating. I have tremendous respect for you and what you have done to this point. So, how can listeners learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, well, the first place you can start is connecting with me on LinkedIn. Always open to chatting with anyone who wants to talk research or tech or safety. You can also check out the Work to Zero website if you're interested in learning more about the safety tech and, safety side of things. We have, a ton of completely free resources that are available. And the last place, especially if you're interested in safety tech, is you and I are going to be hosting a professional development seminar
Oh yeah.
at NSC Spring Safety Congress and Expo on, I believe, May 6th. So, if you want to learn more about safety tech and overcoming some of those barriers and just ask questions about what technologies might work best, I think you and I can hopefully help them out there.
Man, now everybody's going to know that I had an ulterior motive for having you as a guest today.
It's okay. I'll
uh,
just come on another time when I don't have something to plug.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. No, I'm really looking forward to that session. I think it's going to be really informative. The goal is to talk about this stuff, right? What we just talked about today, right? All of those challenges that people face when they're implementing technology and how to really identify what that problem is they're trying to solve, how to identify the technology that's going to solve it, and even how to make sure your organization is ready and build a business case for it. So yeah, that's going to be a really awesome session.
I think so too. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Kenna, is there anything else that I didn't talk about or I didn't ask you about that you want anybody else to know?
No, I don't think so. Like I said, if anyone's interested or wants to talk more about this, I'm always open to talking all things safety tech. I'm also heavily involved in the sort of agriculture world, so anyone there who wants to talk cattle or chickens or anything, let me know.
Yes, and those are great discussions as well. All right. Well, thanks, Kenna. Really appreciate your time on the podcast here, and we'll talk to you later.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Matt.